Close your eyes for a second and ask yourself this one quiet question. What if the world map you trust was redesigned to make you forget something? Tonight's story isn't about legends or myths. It's about names that once appeared on official maps and then vanished. About a civilization called Tartaria, erased without war, and a forgotten system known as Roki, buried beneath modern borders. No loud battles. No burning cities. Just silence, edits, and missing pages. If you enjoy calm, mysterious history that slowly unfolds while you relax or fall asleep, you're in the right place. These stories are meant to be listened to in the dark, with no rush, no stress, just curiosity. Before we begin, take a gentle moment to support this journey. Tap like if you enjoy hidden history. Subscribe if you want more sleeping stories like this. And let the video play. It helps the story travel further. Now breathe slowly. The modern map is fading, and the forgotten world is about to return. Long before clocks divided time into minutes and borders divided land into ownership, the world existed in a quieter rhythm. People measured distance by how long it took the sun to rise and fall, and memory was carried not in books, but in stone, alignment, and story. If you could step back into that world, you wouldn't recognize it from the maps you know today. The land would feel wider. The sky would feel closer. And the idea that the earth could belong to anyone would seem strange. In that earlier age, Tartaria was not a mystery. It was not debated. It was not controversial. It simply was. Travelers spoke of it the way we speak of oceans or mountains, as something vast and present, not needing explanation. Its borders were not drawn sharply, because they were not enforced with violence. Instead, they followed rivers, plains, migration paths, and natural divisions that made sense to those who lived there. People did not say they ruled Tartaria. They said they lived within it. What made Tartaria different was not its size, though it stretched farther than most modern nations combined. It was not its wealth, though accounts describe abundance rather than excess. What set it apart was its relationship with knowledge. Knowledge was not hoarded. It was not restricted to elites. It flowed, quietly and steadily, through generations. Buildings were designed to last, not to impress. Stone structures rose in harmony with the land, not dominance over it. Windows were tall and purposeful, allowing light to travel deep into rooms. Roof lines followed mathematical ratios that repeated across regions thousands of miles apart. To the modern eye, this looks impossible. To them, it was simply how things were done. And then there was Roki. Roki was not a city, not a nation, and not a people in the way we usually define them. Roki was a way of organizing the world. It was a system older than Tartaria itself, a method of understanding land as a shared responsibility rather than a resource to be claimed. Under Roki, land was mapped according to use, stewardship, and seasonal rhythm. Fields changed hands with the climate. Paths shifted as populations moved. Nothing was frozen into permanence. This made Roki invisible to those who came later. Empires require fixed borders. Taxes require ownership. Armies require lines to defend. Roki had none of these. It functioned without force, without centralized authority, and without written law as we know it. Instead, it relied on consensus and continuity. If a place worked, it stayed. If it didn't, it changed. For centuries, Tartaria existed comfortably within this framework. It absorbed ideas, techniques, and people, but it did not expand aggressively. There were no campaigns to conquer distant lands, no monuments celebrating domination. This absence would later become one of the reasons it was erased. History favors noise. Silence is easy to overwrite. As trade routes expanded and outside powers began to move across continents, Tartaria became an inconvenience. Merchants noticed something strange. Goods moved freely through its lands, but control did not. There were no tolls that enriched kings, no monopolies protected by force, no singular authority to negotiate with. To rising empires, this was unacceptable. Maps began to change slowly at first. Early cartographers still labeled Tartaria clearly, often with careful detail. But annotations appeared. Question marks. Alternative names. Regions once unified were suddenly subdivided. Not because the land had changed, but because perception had. At the same time, Roki began to disappear from records entirely. Not violently removed, but quietly ignored. Systems that couldn't be taxed or ruled were deemed irrelevant. Oral traditions were dismissed as folklore. Land use patterns were rewritten as primitive practices. Yet the physical world did not change as easily as the stories. Cities built under Tartarian principles continued to function with minimal modification. Roads aligned too perfectly to be accidental. Foundations ran deeper than officially recorded construction periods allowed. In some places, entire lower floors were later buried, their original entrances sealed and forgotten. Modern explanations would come much later. Floods, renovations, urban development. But these explanations never fully satisfied those who noticed the patterns. Why were similar architectural styles found across continents supposedly isolated from one another? Why did star-aligned buildings appear in regions with no recorded astronomical tradition? Why did old maps, drawn independently by different nations, all agree on Tartaria's existence, until they suddenly didn't? The shift did not happen overnight. There was no single decree that erased Tartaria. Instead, there were reforms, standardizations, educational updates, new naming conventions. Over time, children learned a different version of the world than their grandparents had known. Names changed first. Tartaria was broken into regions with new identities. Each new name came with a new history. Smaller, easier to manage, less connected to a shared past. Roki vanished even more completely. Because it had never relied on writing, once it was no longer practiced, it left almost no trace. Only subtle clues remained. Unusual land divisions. Ancient paths that ignored modern property lines. Villages placed in locations that made no sense under current planning logic. To those who lived through the transition, it felt less like conquest and more like suffocation. A tightening, a narrowing of possibility. The land was still there, but it no longer belonged to the people in the same way. And so the quiet world faded. Not destroyed. Not burned. Just overwritten. By the time industrialization accelerated, Tartaria had become a footnote at best, a myth at worst. Scholars debated whether it had ever truly existed. Textbooks simplified timelines. Complexity was replaced with certainty. Questions were discouraged in favor of clean narratives. But the earth remembers. Stone remembers. Alignment remembers. Even when stories are altered, the physical world holds on to its past with stubborn patience. Today, if you walk through certain old cities late at night, when traffic fades and modern noise settles, you can feel it. A sense that the place was designed for a different pace of life. That it once served a purpose we no longer understand. That the walls are older than they are allowed to be. This is where our story truly begins. Not with a war or a fall, but with a forgetting. With a slow, deliberate shift away from a way of living that did not serve centralized power. As you drift deeper into rest, let this idea settle gently in your mind. History is not only written by victors, it is edited by administrators. redrawn by cartographers, simplified by educators. And sometimes the most important truths are not hidden behind locked doors, but erased so thoroughly that most people never realize they are missing. In the next part of this story, we will follow the trail of old maps more closely. We will look at when Tartaria's name began to vanish, who benefited from its disappearance, and how modern geography was shaped not by discovery, but by decision. For now, rest. The land is still there, and it has more to tell. As Tartaria faded from written memory, something else quietly took its place. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, with a confidence that only repetition can create. New maps were printed, new borders were inked, and with each revision, the world became more rigid, more segmented, more controlled. What had once been drawn as flowing regions now became sharp shapes. Straight lines cut across rivers, forests, and migration paths as if the land itself were an obstacle to be corrected. To the people making these maps, this wasn't deception. It was progress. Order. Civilization. But order always comes at a cost. The earliest modern cartographers didn't invent these changes alone. They worked alongside emerging states, trading companies, and institutions that needed predictability. Trade requires stable routes. Taxation requires fixed populations. Military defense requires clear borders. Tartaria, with its fluid structure and shared stewardship, offered none of that. So it was reinterpreted. In revised texts, Tartaria became a vague term used to describe uncivilized or nomadic peoples. Its unity was reframed as chaos. Its flexibility was labeled backwardness. What had once been an advanced system of balance was reduced to a placeholder for ignorance. This reframing was powerful because it felt logical. It aligned with the story of progress people wanted to believe. That history moves from simple to complex, from wild to controlled, from shared to owned. Roki suffered even more under this new worldview, because Roki couldn't be simplified into a stereotype. It wasn't a culture you could caricature or a people you could marginalize. It was a way of thinking about land that directly contradicted ownership, and that made it dangerous. As land registries expanded, Roki's patterns were replaced with legal descriptions. Measurements replaced memory. Paper replaced consensus. Over time, the old ways became invisible not because they were banned, but because they were no longer recognized. Yet traces remained. In some regions, land parcels still follow curves that make no mathematical sense. Boundaries bend around ancient sites, avoiding them without explanation. Roads suddenly shift direction for no apparent reason, aligning with something no longer visible. These are not accidents. They are fossils of an older system. During the Great Age of Exploration, explorers often described encountering cities that didn't match expectations. Large stone structures in places deemed undeveloped. Infrastructure that suggested planning beyond what local populations were credited with. Instead of questioning the narrative, these observations were often omitted from final report. Yet some people noticed inconsistencies. Buildings dated to periods when the tools supposedly didn't exist. Massive stone structures attributed to small populations with limited resources. Engineering feats explained vaguely or not at all. When questioned, the answers were always the same: lost knowledge, coincidence, or exaggeration. But coincidence does not repeat itself across continents. Roki's absence created another problem. Without it, land management became extractive. Forests were cleared permanently instead of seasonally. Rivers were redirected without regard for long-term balance. Soil was exhausted. The land stopped healing itself. What had once been a relationship became a resource. And resources invite conflict. As borders hardened, wars became inevitable. Not because people were more violent, but because the systems demanded defense. Ownership creates scarcity. Scarcity creates fear. Fear creates aggression. Tartaria's way had minimized this cycle. Not eliminated conflict entirely, but softened it. Without centralized hoarding, there was less incentive to dominate. That softness was interpreted as weakness. By the 19th century, Tartaria existed only in old atlases, dismissed as outdated or inaccurate. Collectors prized these maps for their artistry, not their information. Few questioned why so many independent sources had once agreed on something now declared fictional. And Roki was gone completely. No books. No diagrams. No official acknowledgement. Only behavior patterns that lingered like muscle memory in rural communities. Shared grazing lands. Rotational farming. Seasonal movement that ignored property lines. These practices were eventually outlawed or discouraged, replaced with privatization and permanent settlement. People adapted. Humans always do. But something was lost in the adaptation. A quiet knowledge of how to live without domination. As night deepens, imagine standing at the edge of a modern city. Glass towers glow. Streets hum. Everything is measured, scheduled, owned. Now imagine peeling that away layer by layer. Under the asphalt, older roads appear. Under the foundations, older stones. Under the stones, alignments with the stars. This is not fantasy. This is archaeology. And archaeology has a habit of challenging certainty. In the next part of this story, we will follow one such city. A place officially founded in modern times, yet built upon something much older. A place where Tartarian design still whispers through walls and corridors, waiting for someone quiet enough to listen. For now, let your thoughts slow again. History doesn't disappear. It just waits. Until someone is ready to remember. The city was officially founded in the late modern era, according to plaques, textbooks, and guided tours. Dates were carved neatly into stone, as if certainty itself could be etched into reality. Visitors were told a simple story. A settlement began here, it grew, it modernized, and everything you see rose logically from that timeline. But cities, like people, often remember more than they are allowed to say. If you walk slowly through such a place, especially at night, you begin to notice details that don't quite align with the official version. Doorways that sit half buried below street level. Windows that open into earth instead of air. Stairs that lead downward where no basement should exist. These features are explained away casually. Ground levels rose. The city was rebuilt. Flooding happened long ago. Yet the same patterns appear again and again, in cities separated by oceans, cultures, and climates. This particular city rests beside a river that has shifted course many times. That much is true. But rivers alone do not bury entire stories. They do not raise street levels uniformly across miles of terrain. They do not carefully seal off older entrances while preserving structural integrity above. Someone planned this layering. Long before the city had its modern name, the land was already organized. Roads existed where streets now run. Foundations had been laid with precision that assumed permanence. The earliest visible buildings were not crude beginnings, but refinements built atop something older and sturdier. This is where Tartarian design reveals itself most clearly. Tartarian cities were not chaotic growths. They were planned environments. Streets aligned with cardinal directions. Public buildings were positioned to receive sunlight at specific times of day. Water systems followed gravity and terrain instead of brute force engineering. These designs weren't decorative. They were functional in ways modern construction often forgets. Temperature regulation, natural lighting, acoustics that carried sound without amplification. In this city, the central square still follows those principles, even though no one remembers why. The space feels calm despite traffic. Sound dissipates strangely. People slow their pace unconsciously when they enter it. This is not coincidence. Under Roki, cities were not centers of control. They were gathering points, places of exchange rather than authority. Administration existed, but it did not dominate daily life. There were no towering palaces meant to intimidate, no monuments glorifying rulers. That absence troubled later historians. Without symbols of power, how could a civilization be taken seriously? So power was retroactively assigned. Structures were reinterpreted as palaces or fortresses, even when their layout made no sense for defense. Open courtyards became royal gardens. Public halls became throne rooms, despite lacking any elevation or separation. The reinterpretation was convincing enough to pass without scrutiny. But architecture tells the truth quietly. In this city, archaeologists once uncovered a lower level during infrastructure repairs. Stonework of remarkable quality emerged, complete with drainage channels, wide corridors, and ventilation shafts. The discovery was briefly celebrated, then quickly reburied. Officially, it was deemed unsafe to expose. Unofficially, it complicated the timeline. The stone did not match the supposed era. The tools required to shape it precisely were not meant to exist yet. And most troubling of all, there were no signs of struggle or destruction. No burn marks. No collapsed ceilings. Just abandonment. As if the city had been intentionally covered. This pattern repeats in Tartarian sites across the world. Layers of habitation separated not by catastrophe, but by decision. The older level preserved, the newer one imposed above it. Roki's influence is visible here too, in subtler ways. Land use around the city does not radiate outward randomly. Agricultural zones follow patterns tied to seasonal cycles rather than proximity alone. Even today, some neighborhoods flood while others remain dry, following ancient water logic rather than modern planning. Engineers often blame outdated infrastructure. But the infrastructure isn't outdated. It's older. And it was designed for a different relationship with the land. When modern systems were layered over Roki-based designs, conflicts emerged. Pipes were forced through channels meant for air. Foundations disrupted water flow. Flooding increased, not because of climate alone, but because the old logic was ignored. Yet no one thought to look backward for solutions. Because backward had been labeled primitive. As night deepens, imagine standing at the edge of the excavation site before it was sealed again. Lantern light flickers against stone walls that haven't seen the sky in centuries. The air feels cooler, calmer. The acoustics soften every sound. This place was built for humans, not machines. People once walked these corridors without fear. They gathered, exchanged ideas, rested. They did not rush. They did not compete constantly. Their city did not demand productivity at every moment. That way of life left no dramatic ending. No ruins dramatic enough to inspire legends. Just a quiet transition into something harsher. The new city above inherited the bones of the old, but not its philosophy. And philosophy cannot be excavated easily. Documents from the transition period are rare, but a few remain. In them, officials complain about the difficulty of governing local populations. People resisted fixed taxation. They moved seasonally. They shared land in ways that made ownership unclear. From an administrative perspective, this was chaos. From a human perspective, it was freedom. The solution was gradual standardization. Property laws. Permanent addresses. Censuses. maps that froze movement into lines. Once movement stopped, memory followed. Generations grew up thinking the buried levels were accidents or myths. Children played on streets unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Life moved on. But sometimes, at night, residents report strange sensations. A feeling of familiarity in places they've never been. A sense of calm in certain buildings that doesn't match their appearance. Dreams of hallways and open spaces that don't exist in the modern layout. The subconscious remembers patterns the conscious mind has forgotten. This is how Tartaria survives now. Not in textbooks, but in intuition. Not in monuments, but in alignment. Not in stories told aloud, but in comfort felt without explanation. In the next part of this journey, we will follow the evidence outward from the city. Along old roads that predate official histories. Along trade routes that connected continents before they were supposed to be connected. And we will begin to see how Tartaria was not isolated at all, but part of a network so vast it threatened the very idea of empire. For now, let your thoughts drift gently. The city sleeps. And beneath it, something older still breathes. The roads leading out of the city are almost invisible to the casual observer. Modern asphalt covers them, or dirt paths have shifted, but their original alignments persist beneath layers of time. If you trace them carefully, with patience and quiet observation, patterns emerge. These patterns are too consistent to be accidents. They echo designs found thousands of miles away, in places that, according to modern history, should have had no connection. These were the veins of Tartaria. The lifelines that carry people, ideas, and goods. But unlike roads built for conquest or taxation, Tartarian routes followed logic we no longer use. Rivers guided them, yes, but not always for navigation alone. Hills and valleys dictated curves, but curves were aligned with sunlight, wind, and seasonal cycles. A traveler moving along these paths would experience the land in harmony with its rhythms, not dominated by it. Along some of these routes, you might encounter stone markers. To the untrained eye, they are boundary stones, simple and functional. But on closer inspection, they bear geometric carvings, carefully placed not for decoration but for orientation. Arches and markers align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and certain star patterns. Centuries of wind and rain have worn them down, but the precision remains. These markers were a form of communication, a network of guidance that could only be read by those who knew the system. Roki's imprint appears along these routes as well. Where Tartaria focused on cities and architecture, Roki influenced the land itself. Fields, orchards, and grazing areas were laid out according to subtle rotations. Trees planted in certain alignments ensured soil health. Water channels were dug to follow both terrain and need, maintaining balance without pumps or artificial barriers. Anyone using the land according to Roki's methods would find it fertile and sustainable. Those imposing modern methods would struggle, fighting nature instead of cooperating with it. This network of roads and patterns once enabled a level of trade and communication that modern historians find difficult to accept. Spices, metals, cloth, and knowledge traveled farther and faster than conventional timelines allow. There was no empire controlling it, no military enforcing passage. Yet information moved efficiently, quietly, without drawing attention. As empires rose in the surrounding regions, they noticed this anomaly. Traders reported goods appearing from nowhere. Travelers recounted cities that didn't match known records. Scholars occasionally hinted at advanced techniques and alignments, but these observations were quickly dismissed or buried in obscure publications. Too inconvenient, too threatening. The removal of Tartaria from maps was not merely administrative. It was strategic. A civilization that communicated freely and operated outside centralized control was a challenge to emerging powers. Erasure didn't require armies. It required agreement, or at least acquiescence. Maps were redrawn, textbooks revised, and generations taught a world that never quite existed. Yet physical evidence remained. Roads, buildings, irrigation systems, and agricultural layouts, all stubbornly resisting the erasure. In many cases, modern engineers unknowingly followed Tartarian designs because they were simply the most practical. Streets that avoid natural water hazards. Bridges aligned with natural inclines. Even settlements built on sites of older cities due to inherent advantages in terrain. Roki's influence, though invisible in official records, persisted quietly in rural areas. Families still rotate crops in patterns that reflect centuries-old understanding of the soil. Villagers still build structures with subtle attention to wind, sun, and rain, often without realizing that their methods predate modern building codes. These are living fossils of a worldview deliberately removed from memory. As night falls over these landscapes, imagine walking along one of these ancient routes. Stones underfoot resonate with the footsteps of those who traveled centuries ago. Trees sway as they did when Roki's principles guided their placement. Water whispers along channels carefully carved to nourish without draining. The land remembers, even when humans do not. And yet, in some places, the memory of Tartaria and Roki fights to be acknowledged. Scholars who study anomalies, maps that contradict each other, and structures that defy conventional timelines are often dismissed as eccentric or speculative. The systems they uncover are too vast, too interconnected, and too efficient to fit into the accepted narrative of history. This makes the pursuit dangerous, but irresistible. The more one observes, the more impossible it becomes to ignore. Patterns repeat across continents. Architectural styles converge without known communication. Road networks reflect the same underlying principles thousands of miles apart. It suggests a civilization whose reach and sophistication exceeded what is currently admitted. In the quiet of night, the roads whisper their secrets. The land itself, shaped by centuries of careful alignment, holds knowledge of a civilization removed from history. Tartaria was more than a collection of cities. Roki was more than a land management system. Together, they formed a network, a philosophy, and a rhythm of life deliberately overwritten. The true story is not found in textbooks or official maps. It is embedded in the ground, in the layout of cities, the flow of rivers, and the alignment of ancient structures. And for those patient enough to observe, the echoes of Tartaria and Roki offer a different way of seeing the world, one that challenges the assumptions of ownership, control, and permanence. Tonight, as you rest, imagine tracing these roads in your mind, following them quietly through fields, forests, and across rivers. Notice the alignments, the curves, the markers that speak of knowledge older than any modern claim. Sense the harmony they represent. Sense what was lost when these systems were buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, history, and concrete. In the next chapter, we will explore the global connections of Tartaria. How distant regions, supposedly unlinked, share architectural, technological, and agricultural patterns. And we will begin to see why these connections were dangerous to empires, and why they were systematically hidden. Let your thoughts drift along the roads tonight. They still lead somewhere, if you are willing to follow. Long before the modern world stitched continents together with railways and telegraphs, Tartaria had already established invisible networks that connected distant regions. Not through force, but through shared understanding and practical design. Across mountains, rivers, and plains, the civilization left traces of methods so consistent that modern scholars struggle to explain them without invoking improbable coincidences. Buildings thousands of miles apart exhibit similar architectural principles. Windows, arches, and domes appear in precise ratios, as if a single guiding hand had influenced them. Roads and bridges follow alignments that prioritize efficiency and harmony rather than conquest or taxation. Agricultural practices mirror each other across continents, designed to maintain soil fertility and water balance without modern machinery. These patterns suggest communication. Ideas traveled, perhaps even before long-distance travel became common, or perhaps through systems we have yet to understand. Some researchers speculate about messengers, signals, or knowledge preserved in secret guilds. Others hint at methods lost to time, perhaps encoded in stone, in geometry, in the stars themselves. Whatever the mechanism, the outcome is undeniable. Distant societies independently arrived at remarkably similar solutions. And then there is the matter of erasure. As Tartaria's influence became inconvenient to rising powers, systematic efforts began to obscure these connections. Maps were redrawn. Names were changed. Systems of land use, once transparent and communal under Roki, were privatized and rigidly enforced. Roads that once guided travelers across continents were renamed or destroyed, their utility hidden beneath layers of modern construction. Despite these efforts, remnants persist. In some regions, ancient bridges remain in use, their engineering inexplicably advanced for the era. In others, irrigation channels carved into stone continue to deliver water precisely where it is needed, despite centuries of neglect. Architects studying old buildings are often struck by the consistency of structural ratios and layouts, yet official histories dismiss such similarities as coincidental or derivative. Consider a traveler moving along a Tartarian trade route. This path, spanning hundreds or even thousands of miles, is punctuated by markers, carved stones, aligned obelisks, or carefully placed trees. To the casual observer, they seem decorative or random. But to those who understand the system, they provide orientation, timing, and information. A journey that might appear arduous is made seamless by knowledge embedded in the landscape itself. Roki's influence is even subtler. Land is organized not for ownership, but for balance. Fields are rotated according to seasonal cycles. Water channels follow natural contours, minimizing erosion and maximizing yield. Villages are sited according to wind patterns, sunlight, and access to resources, not arbitrary borders. Observing these patterns today, one sees an intelligence that predates modern surveying techniques and challenges the assumption that centralized control is necessary for efficiency. This network of knowledge made Tartaria both remarkable and dangerous. To empires accustomed to domination, a civilization that could coordinate across vast distances without rulers, armies, or taxation threatened the very foundations of power. Erasing it from memory was more than a cultural act, it was a political necessity. Yet nature itself preserved the story. Roads that follow terrain, rather than imposed grids, survive as subtle curves in modern highways. Architectural principles are encoded in stone, resisting demolition. Agricultural wisdom persists in traditional practices that endure in pockets despite modern methods. Even buried cities, sealed beneath layers of soil and concrete, retain evidence of planning that cannot be explained by chance. In some cases, Tartarian influence crossed oceans. Similarities in design appear between structures in Europe, Asia, and North America, suggesting knowledge transfer far earlier than official timelines allow. Historians debate the plausibility of these connections, often dismissing them as coincidence. But the repetition of architectural ratios, road alignments, and agricultural layouts across continents challenges simple explanations. The more one investigates, the more patterns emerge. Temple orientations mirror celestial events across thousands of miles. Bridges employ identical engineering principles where contact between builders is historically improbable. Town layouts reflect systems of water management and seasonal rotation consistent with Roki's principles. Across vast distances, the logic of design repeats like a hidden language. And in this repetition lies both a warning and an invitation. The warning is that knowledge can be suppressed, erased, or forgotten. The invitation is that patterns endure, waiting for the patient observer to recognize them. Tartaria and Roki were buried not by destruction, but by omission and reinterpretation. The stories of their ingenuity survive quietly in stone, land, and design. Imagine walking along a deserted path at dusk, following the subtle curves of an ancient road. Each step aligns with centuries of human planning. You feel a sense of direction without knowing why. You sense a connection to a civilization that existed outside the frameworks we accept. And for a moment, you glimpse the world as it was before maps dictated understanding, before borders defined ownership, and before history decided what was worth remembering. Tonight, let this vision unfold in your mind. Let the roads, buildings, and fields of Tartaria and Roki guide you gently through time. Sense the patterns, the alignments, and the hidden intelligence. Feel the quiet knowledge that persists despite attempts to erase it. In the next chapter, we will explore how modern powers actively suppress this knowledge. How rulers, educators, and mapmakers systematically rewrote history to eliminate Tartaria and Roki from consciousness. And we will uncover the subtle methods by which evidence was hidden in plain sight. Drift along these ancient networks for now. They are still alive, even if the world above has forgotten. As modern empires expanded, they quickly realized that knowledge was as powerful as armies, perhaps more so. Tartaria and Roki were not just inconvenient, they were dangerous. They represented systems of living, building, and thinking that didn't require rulers, taxes, or borders. To consolidate control, rising powers needed to suppress this knowledge, not merely ignore it. Suppression began subtly. Maps, which had once faithfully depicted Tartaria as a unified land, were redrawn. Early cartographers labeled regions differently, subdividing vast territories into smaller, supposedly independent states. Rivers, mountains, and plains were divided into neat quadrants, often ignoring natural geography. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible, but relentless. Within a few generations, the name, Tartaria, disappeared from commonly circulated maps. At the same time, educational institutions adopted standardized curricula. Children learned a version of history stripped of anomalies. Accounts of unusual architecture, advanced infrastructure, and agricultural systems that didn't fit the new narrative were minimized or omitted entirely. Oral traditions were dismissed as folklore. Anyone who tried to question the official story risked ridicule or marginalization. The suppression extended beyond books and maps. Archaeological evidence was often misinterpreted or ignored. When construction unearthed Tartarian foundations or Roki-based land divisions, officials frequently labeled them as accidental, primitive, or irrelevant. Lower city levels, intricate stonework, and irrigation systems were sometimes sealed again, covered by soil, asphalt, or modern structures. The earth itself became a repository of secrets too inconvenient for the official timeline. This erasure was deliberate, but it required subtlety. Open destruction would have drawn attention, while quiet omission created plausible deniability. Maps could be redrawn, buildings misdated, and textbooks rewritten, and most people would accept the new story without question. Over time, Tartaria and Roki became ghosts, visible only to those who studied old maps, ancient structures, or rural land patterns with patience and skepticism. Historians who noticed inconsistencies often faced resistance. Their findings were labeled speculative or eccentric. Journals refused to publish anomalies. Universities dismissed certain lines of inquiry as unnecessary. and funding for unconventional research dried up. In essence, the system protected itself by controlling what could be studied, taught, and believed. Yet evidence persisted, stubborn and silent. Architectural styles that appeared simultaneously in distant regions defied accepted timelines. Cities aligned with celestial patterns long before modern astronomy could explain them. Roads connected settlements in ways that maximized efficiency and harmony rather than profit or control. Fields rotated crops according to centuries-old methods. The world remembered what human memory had been instructed to forget. One striking example appears in Eurasia, where buildings separated by thousands of miles share strikingly similar proportions, domes, and archways. Even materials differ, yet the geometric ratios remain consistent. Scholars have tried to attribute these similarities to trade or imitation, but the repetition is far too precise to be coincidental. These were blueprints of a civilization that communicated its principles silently and effectively across continents. Meanwhile, Roki's land management principles quietly persisted in villages and rural areas. Crop rotation, soil preservation, and water distribution systems continued to function under local traditions, often without written records. Communities using these methods experienced long-term fertility and sustainability, while nearby regions following imposed modern systems often struggled with soil depletion, water scarcity, and failed harvests. The suppression of Tartaria and Roki was more than historical revisionism. It reshaped civilization itself. By removing knowledge that didn't serve centralized control, empires created dependency on official systems. People lost the skills and understanding to manage land, build efficiently, or navigate without guidance. Freedoms embedded in these older systems, movement, communal stewardship, alignment with nature, were replaced with rigid hierarchies and bureaucratic oversight. Even today, the remnants of these suppressions are visible. Modern urban layouts often ignore the natural flow of terrain, rivers are redirected against their courses, and roads prioritize property lines over efficiency or environmental harmony. Yet, beneath the surface, Tartarian and Roki patterns persist. Some streets curve inexplicably. Some buildings align with celestial markers. Some fields flourish, following rotation systems long abandoned by modern agriculture. In this way, Tartaria and Roki survived, through persistence rather than prominence. The civilization may have been erased from textbooks and maps, but it remained embedded in stone, soil, and sky. For those who know where to look, the patterns are unmistakable, a silent testament to ingenuity that once challenged the very idea of centralized power. Tonight, let your mind wander along these hidden paths. Imagine the old networks of roads, waterways, and settlements, still intact beneath the layers of modern civilization. Consider how knowledge can persist, even when suppressed, and how the earth itself holds memory longer than any human institution. In the next chapter, we will explore the enigmatic architecture of Tartaria, how their structures defy conventional timelines, repeat across continents, and reveal a civilization both advanced and deliberate in ways modern engineers struggle to understand. Rest now. Let your imagination trace the hidden alignments and streets that refuse to vanish completely. Tartarian architecture is one of the most striking remnants of a civilization that official history claims never existed. Walk through any city with buried layers or old districts, and subtle patterns emerge: domes, arches, windows, and structural proportions that repeat across continents, as if drawn from the same invisible blueprint. These patterns are too consistent to be coincidence, too sophisticated to be accidental, and too deliberate to be misunderstood as primitive imitation. The foundations of their buildings are often massive, laid with precision that defies what historians claim was possible for the time. Stones are cut to fit so perfectly that mortar seems almost unnecessary. Walls rise in straight, unwavering lines, often with multiple layers of structural reinforcement hidden from casual view. In some cases, entire lower floors are buried underground, sealed by intention rather than decay or flood, preserving them like time capsules. Ceilings and roof lines are aligned with the sun, stars, and seasonal cycles. Windows are not randomly placed. They are designed to allow light to travel deep into the rooms during certain hours of the day or year. Some structures are aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or specific star formations, suggesting knowledge of astronomy embedded into urban planning. These alignments appear across regions supposedly unconnected at the time, indicating a shared understanding or exchange of knowledge far earlier than modern historians accept. Many buildings incorporate advanced heating, ventilation, and water systems. Stone channels for water are carved to maximize flow and efficiency without pumps or modern technology. Some structures even suggest rudimentary forms of air conditioning, using airflow and thermal principles to regulate temperature. For a civilization that supposedly vanished without leaving industrial evidence, the sophistication is extraordinary. What is most remarkable, however, is the consistency of these architectural principles across vast distances. Domes and arches appear in Europe, Asia, and parts of North America, often in nearly identical proportions. Road systems align with urban centers in a way that balances efficiency and harmony with natural landscapes. Even decorative elements seem to follow geometric ratios that suggest a deep understanding of mathematics, art, and spatial logic. Roki's influence complements this architectural mastery. The land itself, organized according to its principles, supports the structures that rise above it. Fields rotate crops to maintain soil fertility. Water channels feed irrigation systems that sustain both rural and urban areas. Roads and settlements follow natural contours, preserving the environment while facilitating human movement. Tartarian buildings were not isolated creations. They were integrated into a living ecosystem, designed for both sustainability and harmony. Yet, when modern powers encountered these structures, they often misinterpreted or dismissed them. Without the context of Roki's land systems or the continuity of Tartarian knowledge, officials and scholars labeled them as anomalies, coincidences, or decorative excess. Foundations were rebuilt without understanding the original purpose. Roads were straightened, water channels redirected, and architectural details covered or destroyed. Despite this, the intelligence embedded in these structures persists. Engineers and architects studying ancient buildings often notice subtle efficiencies unnoticed in contemporary construction. Arches distribute weight more effectively. Windows capture natural light. Stone foundations resist erosion in ways modern methods fail to replicate. The buildings themselves are silent teachers, offering lessons lost to time yet still applicable. Tartarian architecture also carries symbolic meaning. Public spaces are wide and open, designed for communal gathering rather than domination. Palaces or administrative centers are often indistinguishable from ordinary civic buildings, reflecting a society that did not rely on intimidation to maintain order. This egalitarian approach contrasts sharply with the monumental structures built to impress or control, which dominate later historical narratives. The repetition of these architectural features across continents suggests a civilization capable of long-distance knowledge exchange. Traders, travelers, or secret networks may have carried designs, methods, and principles far beyond the reach of official historical records. What remains is a silent global language of stone, geometry, and alignment, waiting for those patient enough to observe and understand. In modern cities, remnants of Tartarian architecture often survive hidden beneath layers of urban development. Street levels rise, buildings are reconstructed, and history is rewritten, but the underlying logic persists. Uneven roads, oddly aligned streets, buried foundations, and strangely proportioned buildings all hint at a past deliberately erased but stubbornly persistent. Imagine walking through one of these ancient structures at dusk. Stone underfoot hums with centuries of careful planning. Windows filter fading light in patterns designed long ago. Air flows through corridors exactly as intended by architects who understood both human needs and natural forces. You feel a calm, almost imperceptible rhythm in the space, a connection to a way of living that valued balance over domination, harmony over control. This is the essence of Tartarian design, knowledge embedded in form, not words, wisdom expressed through construction, not decree. And even when the civilization that created it is removed from memory, the buildings continue to speak, quietly, to anyone who observes with care. In the next chapter, we will explore how these architectural principles link to technology and infrastructure, revealing methods that challenge conventional timelines. Water systems, road networks, and urban layouts suggest a civilization far more advanced than the one modern historians describe. Let your mind drift through these ancient halls tonight, tracing arches, domes, and hidden channels. Sense the intelligence that endures, even beneath layers of soil and history. Beneath the grandeur of Tartarian architecture lies a layer of technology and infrastructure that defies the conventional understanding of history. Modern engineers studying old cities often stumble upon systems that appear far more sophisticated than anything recorded for the time. Stone channels for water, precise road alignments, and multi-level construction suggest not just advanced design, but advanced understanding of physics, hydrology, and materials. Water management was central to Tartarian planning. In many cities, aqueducts, canals, and underground channels carried fresh water over long distances without pumps. Gravity was used strategically, directing flow through filters and reservoirs, supplying homes, public baths, and irrigation systems. Some channels show evidence of sediment control, debris management, and flow regulation, designed to last centuries without human intervention. Modern engineers often marvel at how these systems function seamlessly, relying only on natural forces and precise planning. Roki principles complemented these technological achievements. Land use was not arbitrary. It followed patterns that ensured sustainability. Crop rotation, soil preservation, and flood management were embedded into the very layout of settlements. Roads were not simply paths connecting points. They served as conduits for water, commerce, and social interaction. Bridges and causeways aligned with terrain, reducing erosion and supporting heavy loads without modern reinforcement materials. Across continents, similar innovations appear independently, or perhaps as a shared knowledge network. In Eurasia, canals follow identical principles to those in parts of North America, despite a supposed lack of contact between the regions. Buildings incorporate hidden water channels, drainage, and ventilation systems that are practically identical in design. Scholars argue over whether this is coincidence, imitation, or evidence of a lost global network. The evidence leans heavily toward deliberate knowledge transfer. Road networks further illustrate Tartaria's sophistication. Unlike straight, grid-like roads imposed by later empires, Tartarian paths follow natural terrain but maintain optimal efficiency. Curves align with hills, rivers, and seasonal water flows. Routes connect settlements strategically for trade, communication, and resource distribution, yet they do so in a way that minimizes environmental disruption. Travelers would have experienced smooth journeys guided by terrain, light, and seasonal markers embedded in the path itself. Even city layouts reflect technological foresight. Open spaces serve as flood buffers, public squares allow air circulation to regulate temperature, and building orientations maximize sunlight while reducing heat retention. Foundations are reinforced in ways that resist earthquakes, floods, and erosion. These features suggest a civilization deeply attuned to its environment, creating cities that were both resilient and sustainable. When modern powers encountered these systems, many aspects were misunderstood or deliberately ignored. Buried water channels were filled or diverted. Roads were straightened to accommodate new vehicles or property lines. Foundations were demolished to make way for modern construction. At the same time, educational and historical narratives downplayed these discoveries, labeling them as anomalies or attributing them to primitive ingenuity, rather than deliberate planning. The suppression was not random. By obscuring Tartaria's technological achievements, rising empires could assert that progress originated with them, while erasing evidence of an alternative system that thrived without central control. Knowledge that empowered communities independently, water management, urban planning, and sustainable agriculture, was inconvenient for centralized authority. It was far easier to rewrite history than to contend with the implications of these systems still in use. Yet the infrastructure persists, quietly resisting erasure. In remote regions, ancient irrigation systems still function. Roads follow centuries-old alignments. Buildings, though renovated or partially destroyed, retain geometric proportions and structural techniques that modern builders struggle to replicate. Even modern urban planning sometimes unknowingly follows ancient principles, revealing the persistence of this knowledge. Consider standing beside a Tartarian aqueduct at dusk. Water flows silently through stone channels carved centuries ago. The air carries a faint, cool current, guided by architectural features that anticipate ventilation. Every stone is placed with purpose. Every alignment is intentional. And though the civilization that built it is erased from textbooks, the system still works, reminding us that intelligence can endure in physical form even when human memory fails. This endurance highlights a crucial point. Tartaria and Roki were not merely civilizations. They were philosophies embedded into the land itself. Knowledge was expressed through construction, alignment, and sustainable practice, not just in books or proclamations. The erasure of their names does not erase the wisdom encoded in the earth. In the next chapter, we will examine Tartaria's influence on trade and movement. How these infrastructure networks enabled efficient communication, distribution of resources, and the spread of knowledge across vast distances, and why this network was threatening to centralized powers. Let your mind wander along these aqueducts, roads, and foundations tonight. Feel the ingenuity beneath your feet and the hidden intelligence that continues to flow silently through the world. The roads and water channels of Tartaria were more than practical infrastructure. They were the veins and arteries of a civilization that spanned continents. These networks allowed people, goods, and knowledge to flow freely, without the interference of centralized control. Unlike empires that relied on taxation, checkpoints, and militarized trade routes, Tartaria's pathways facilitated movement by design, not decree. Merchants could transport goods across hundreds of miles with remarkable efficiency. Spices, metals, textiles, and raw materials traveled along these routes, connecting regions that modern history often portrays as isolated. Cities were strategically positioned along these networks, acting as hubs where travelers could rest, exchange goods, and pass knowledge to the next settlement. Unlike later trade centers, these hubs did not dominate surrounding regions. They existed in harmony, serving community needs rather than consolidating wealth or power. Roki's principles underpinned this system. Land, water, and roads were integrated to support both local and long-distance movement. Seasonal cycles dictated the timing of certain routes. Floodplains and irrigation channels were considered in road placement, ensuring that paths remained functional year-round. Crops, livestock, and resources were transported with minimal strain on the environment, reflecting a civilization attuned to sustainability as much as efficiency. Modern historians struggle to explain the speed and coordination of these networks. Conventional timelines suggest limited communication technology, yet Tartarian cities seem to operate as if informed by a shared understanding. Architectural similarities, road alignments, and agricultural practices repeat across regions separated by oceans and mountains. Such uniformity implies either extraordinary coincidence or the existence of knowledge networks far more advanced than acknowledged. Rulers of emerging empires quickly recognized the threat. A system that enabled autonomous regions to function efficiently, without centralized taxation or control, undermined the logic of conquest. The more efficient Tartaria appeared, the more inconvenient it became for those seeking dominance. And so, erasure became the chosen method of control. Maps were redrawn to obscure these networks. Roads were straightened, renamed, or destroyed. Water channels were diverted. Agricultural patterns were disrupted. Even city layouts were altered to enforce central authority, ignoring the centuries of planning that made them sustainable. Where previously infrastructure guided human behavior gently and predictably, new systems imposed rigidity, forcing populations to comply with imposed rules rather than natural harmony. Despite these interventions, Tartaria's networks persisted. In many regions, roads still follow curves designed for water flow and seasonal travel. Bridges remain in use, engineered for durability beyond the supposed technological capabilities of the time. Irrigation systems still nourish fields in patterns aligned with centuries-old rotation principles. The networks continue to function, quietly demonstrating a level of sophistication erased from written history. Observers who trace these paths often notice anomalies. Towns that should be disconnected are connected. Resource distribution appears coordinated despite the absence of centralized planning. Trade patterns defy expectations based on known historical timelines. And in some cases, physical alignments correspond to celestial events, suggesting that these routes also carry cultural and astronomical significance. Even today, the remnants of Tartaria's infrastructure guide modern travel. Roads, canals, and city layouts follow ancient logic. Engineers sometimes unknowingly adopt principles perfected centuries earlier. Farmers in rural regions continue practices aligned with Roki's methods, sustaining soil fertility and managing water with remarkable efficiency. These surviving systems hint at a lost civilization capable of organizing both people and resources at a scale we are only beginning to appreciate. In the quiet of night, imagine yourself following one of these ancient roads. The path curves gently with the landscape. Water channels run beside it, engineered for centuries of use. You pass through towns and cities whose architecture mirrors distant regions. Each step reveals an intelligence designed not for domination, but for cooperation and sustainability. This network, silent, persistent, and hidden beneath the weight of rewritten history, remains one of Tartaria's greatest legacies. It demonstrates that knowledge and civilization do not always need empires or kings to flourish. They need vision, design, and a philosophy of living in balance with the world. In the next chapter, we will explore the political and cultural mechanisms that contributed to Tartaria's disappearance from official history. How maps, education, and narrative control systematically erased the memory of a civilization that thrived without domination, and why these methods were more effective than destruction. Let your mind follow these roads tonight. Trace the hidden currents of trade, water, and thought that once connected the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. As Tartaria's networks persisted quietly across continents, emerging empires realized that erasure required more than physical alteration. It required controlling the story itself. Maps, textbooks, and official narratives became tools of suppression. By rewriting what people believed about the past, rulers could obscure the very existence of Tartaria and Roki without leaving obvious evidence of destruction. Cartographers were the first line of this quiet erasure. Early maps carefully recorded Tartaria, but as imperial influence grew, revisions began to appear. Boundaries were redrawn, territories subdivided, and names replaced. Rivers were straightened or renamed, mountains were misaligned to suit the new story. The maps still looked plausible, but they systematically removed references to the civilization's scope, sophistication, and influence. What had once appeared as a unified, functioning network of cities and infrastructure became fragmented, chaotic, or labeled as unknown or undeveloped regions. Education reinforced these changes. Schools began teaching tidy versions of history, timelines simplified, civilizations categorized neatly, and anomalies dismissed. Children learned that empires rose through conquest and innovation, that progress followed a linear path, and that any advanced systems preceding these empires were myths, accidents, or exaggerations. This effectively rewrote collective memory. By the time adults reached positions of influence, Tartaria existed only in the margins, briefly mentioned in old atlases, dismissed as outdated, or ignored entirely. Written records were controlled as well. Scholars who questioned the official narrative faced marginalization. Reports of unusual architecture, advanced engineering, or agricultural practices inconsistent with the official timeline were relegated to obscure journals or dismissed as speculation. Libraries curated collections to reinforce dominant narratives, while inconvenient documents were lost, destroyed, or misfiled. In this way, the very evidence of Tartaria's existence was filtered, leaving only traces visible to those willing to dig deeply and question assumptions. At the same time, land use policies systematically erased Roki. Fields that had rotated crops according to centuries-old principles were consolidated under modern land ownership laws. Water channels carefully designed to manage seasonal flow were diverted or sealed. Villages built according to natural alignment were reshaped or relocated. These interventions not only removed physical evidence of Roki but also destroyed the living systems that perpetuated its knowledge. Without practice, the wisdom embedded in the land faded, leaving communities dependent on imposed structures rather than inherited understanding. Even architectural achievements were reinterpreted to fit the official narrative. Large domes, perfectly aligned streets, and multi-level buildings were attributed to rulers, kings, or empires that supposedly introduced advanced methods. The original intent, to create harmony with nature, sustainability, and communal utility, was replaced by explanations of power, conquest, or prestige. This reframing shifted perception from functional intelligence to spectacle, erasing the philosophy that had guided construction. Maps, education, and narrative control worked in concert to produce a population largely unaware of what had been lost. Physical evidence persisted, yes, but the context that gave it meaning was stripped away. Without understanding Tartaria's systems or Roki's principles, modern observers often interpret ancient cities as anomalies, coincidences, or failures of imagination. The civilization's ingenuity survives, but in fragments, misunderstood and undervalued. And yet, resistance to erasure appears in unexpected ways. Rural communities, following inherited agricultural and water practices, unconsciously preserve Roki. Buried foundations, hidden aqueducts, and aligned buildings continue to function despite centuries of neglect. Even urban planning occasionally follows the subtle patterns of ancient road networks, revealing a knowledge embedded so deeply that it persists regardless of official recognition. Consider the subtle methods of suppression: a map redrawn slightly each generation, a textbook revised with new dates, a city rebuilt over the old with little explanation. These interventions appear benign individually, but cumulatively they erase entire systems of knowledge and living practice. By controlling the narrative, Empires achieved something far more permanent than conquest. They made generations forget what they had once known intuitively. And yet, Tartaria survives in quiet persistence. Architects, engineers, and farmers unwittingly follow its principles. Roads curve naturally, water flows efficiently, and buildings remain structurally sound long after the culture that built them has vanished from memory. The civilization's legacy exists not in textbooks, but in the functional intelligence embedded in the land itself. Tonight, as you rest, imagine walking through these layers of history. Follow the subtle alignments of streets, canals, and fields. Sense the philosophy embedded in every stone, every waterway, every curve of the road. The knowledge that once coordinated cities, trade networks, and land management still hums beneath the surface, waiting for the patient observer to perceive it. In the next chapter, we will explore Tartaria's mysterious symbols and communication methods. How geometric carvings, star alignments, and hidden markers transmitted knowledge across vast distances, defying the need for written language or centralized authority. Let your mind trace these invisible networks tonight, and sense the quiet persistence of a civilization erased from official memory. Tartaria's most mysterious legacy lies not only in its architecture or infrastructure, but in the symbols and markers scattered across its landscapes. These are subtle signs, geometric carvings on stone, alignment of buildings with celestial events, and markers placed along roads or waterways, that communicated information across distances without written text. They functioned as a silent language, one that required observation, pattern recognition, and understanding of natural cycles to decode. These symbols are not random. Across continents, you can find similar geometric motifs engraved into stones, etched into building facades, or incorporated into bridges and aqueducts. Triangles, circles, and complex polygonal patterns appear repeatedly, often positioned in ways that align with sunrise, sunset, solstices, or other celestial phenomena. These alignments suggest that Tartaria's engineers and planners were encoding information about time, navigation, and environmental cycles directly into the built environment. Roki's influence amplifies this effect. Where architecture and roads were designed for functionality, symbols and markers served as practical guides. A specific shape carved into a stone along a trade route could indicate seasonal changes, water flow, or nearby resources. Alignment with stars could signal timing for planting, travel, or ceremonial events. Travelers familiar with these codes would move efficiently, while outsiders would perceive only decorative features, missing the functional intelligence hidden in plain sight. Some markers appear in patterns that form large-scale maps or networks, visible only from certain perspectives or distances. Archaeologists have discovered stones laid out over miles in alignments that mirror constellations, mountain ranges, or river systems. These formations act as navigational tools, linking settlements and trade hubs without relying on written documentation. Modern researchers often overlook them, interpreting them as art or coincidence, but their precision defies chance. Communication through these symbols required skill and observation rather than force. Knowledge passed between generations orally, reinforced by physical cues embedded in the environment. Unlike empires that relied on written decrees and armies to maintain control, Tartaria's networks relied on shared understanding and natural intelligence. It was a system that could transmit complex knowledge efficiently without imposing rigid authority. Interestingly, similar symbols and alignments appear in regions historically separated by supposed cultural isolation. Bridges, buildings, and stones thousands of miles apart employ nearly identical geometric principles. Some researchers suggest that this indicates either advanced long-distance communication or a shared ancient framework of knowledge, one that predates the civilizations recorded in conventional history. The suppression of Tartaria made this system even more subtle. By rewriting maps, altering landscapes, and imposing new construction over old routes, empires effectively buried the symbolic language. Many markers remain hidden beneath soil, roads, and buildings, surviving only as anomalies or curiosities. Yet those who look carefully, through pattern recognition, comparison, and awareness of natural alignments, can rediscover the intelligence embedded in these structures. In some regions, villages and cities still unknowingly preserve aspects of this symbolic communication. Streets follow the alignments of ancient markers. Irrigation systems respect the flow indicated by buried symbols. Even building layouts retain ratios and positions that once conveyed information about environmental cycles or resource distribution. These traces survive because they are functional. Practicality preserved them long after the original meaning was forgotten. Tartaria's symbols were a form of decentralized control, not coercive governance. They guided communities to act in harmony with the land, the seasons, and each other. This approach contrasts sharply with centralized empires that imposed artificial hierarchies, borders, and taxes. Where traditional rulers relied on force or decree, Tartaria relied on shared intelligence, observation, and trust in natural systems. This method of communication also ensured resilience. Written records can be destroyed, monuments can be demolished, libraries can burn. But encoded knowledge within stone, alignment, and geometry resists both time and human interference. Even as maps were redrawn, texts rewritten, and official narratives altered, the symbols of Tartaria persisted, embedded into the earth itself. Tonight, as you let your mind drift, imagine walking along an ancient road, observing subtle carvings on stones, noticing how a window aligns with the rising sun, or how a bridge mirrors a distant river bend. Sense the intelligence encoded into the environment, the silent instructions that guided trade, agriculture, and social life for centuries. Even forgotten, these markers continue to direct, teach, and preserve knowledge. In the next chapter, we will explore Tartaria's mysterious global influence. How trade, architecture, and symbolic systems connected regions historically assumed to be isolated, and why these connections were systematically erased from history. Let your mind trace the hidden messages tonight, quietly following the lines, carvings, and alignments that survived centuries of deliberate forgetting. Tartaria's influence was not confined to one region, it stretched across continents, leaving traces in architecture, trade, and symbolic systems that suggest a level of global coordination long before modern history acknowledges such connections. Cities separated by oceans exhibit remarkably similar layouts, domes, arches, and street alignments. Trade routes mirror each other across continents, and agricultural systems follow patterns consistent with Roki principles, even where contact between regions was supposedly impossible. Merchants and travelers moved along networks that were surprisingly efficient, connecting distant cities with predictable timing and resource distribution. Unlike later empires that relied on taxation, checkpoints, and armies to control trade, Tartaria's system functioned on shared understanding, observation of natural cues, and encoded knowledge in architecture and symbols. Goods, ideas, and information traveled freely, creating a network that linked communities across vast distances without central oversight. This global reach was a threat to emerging empires. A civilization capable of coordinating activity, knowledge, and infrastructure without rulers undermined the logic of conquest. Erasure became a necessity, and the mechanisms of suppression were subtle yet comprehensive. Maps were redrawn, histories rewritten, trade routes altered, and symbols buried beneath layers of construction. By controlling perception rather than destruction alone, empires ensured that Tartaria's legacy would appear fragmented, its coherence denied. Despite these efforts, Tartaria's influence persisted. Architectural similarities can be found in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, with precise proportions, geometrical layouts, and structural designs repeated across regions. Road alignments, water channels, and field rotations follow identical principles, indicating shared knowledge or an underlying framework guiding multiple societies. Even local myths and folklore sometimes preserve hints of these systems, describing cities, roads, or techniques that historians later dismiss as exaggeration or legend. Roki's land management principles complement this global influence. Communities using rotation systems, water channels, and sustainable planning often thrive centuries later, even without written records. Crops flourish, soil retains fertility, and water flows efficiently along ancient routes. In this way, Tartaria's philosophy endured, not just as isolated evidence in stone or structure, but as living practice embedded in the land itself. The subtlety of Tartaria's global network also made it resilient. Unlike empires dependent on military or bureaucratic control, its knowledge persisted in practical application, architecture, and trade patterns. When suppression occurred, the functionality of these systems allowed them to continue unnoticed. Roads still guided travelers efficiently. Buildings remained structurally sound. Irrigation systems delivered water precisely. These remnants silently resisted erasure, preserving the essence of the civilization even when its name was forgotten. Interestingly, some modern anomalies in urban planning, infrastructure, and architecture can be traced back to Tartaria. Roads curve inexplicably, streets align with natural features rather than imposed grids, and older buildings demonstrate construction techniques far ahead of their supposed time. Engineers and archaeologists studying these features often recognize their sophistication but struggle to place them within accepted historical timelines. Tartaria's global influence also challenges assumptions about technological progress. Where history presents innovation as linear and empire-driven, Tartaria demonstrates that advanced knowledge and infrastructure can emerge outside centralized power, spread through shared understanding, and endure even when memory is suppressed. Its systems prove that civilization need not rely on conquest or rigid hierarchy to achieve remarkable efficiency, architectural sophistication, and sustainability. Tonight, imagine standing at a crossroads connecting multiple regions, tracing the invisible paths carved across continents. See the architectural echoes in distant cities, the agricultural systems that thrive across hemispheres, and the symbolic markers guiding travelers silently through time. The global imprint of Tartaria stretches far beyond what maps or textbooks acknowledge, linking civilizations through practical intelligence, shared observation, and harmonious design. In the final chapter, we will explore how all these pieces, architecture, infrastructure, symbols, and networks, come together to reveal the hidden philosophy of Tartaria and Roki. We will examine what modern civilization can learn from these systems and how remnants of this lost knowledge persist today, quietly shaping the world beneath the surface of memory. Let your thoughts wander along the invisible threads connecting the world tonight, sensing the enduring intelligence of a civilization deliberately hidden, yet never fully erased. The story of Tartaria and Roki is not just one of cities, roads, or symbols. It is a story of philosophy, of a way of living in harmony with the land, time, and each other. While empires rose and history was rewritten to erase them, the principles of these civilizations remain embedded in the world itself, quietly shaping the environment, human behavior, and even modern infrastructure. At the heart of Tartaria was an understanding that civilization does not need domination to function. Cities were organized to balance human activity with natural cycles. Buildings, roads, and waterways were designed to maximize efficiency, sustainability, and harmony. Knowledge was encoded in stone, in land, and in shared practice rather than in rigid hierarchies. Rulers were unnecessary because systems guided behavior subtly and effectively. Roki's influence extended this philosophy to the land itself. Crops were rotated to maintain soil fertility. Water was distributed in a manner that ensured long-term sustainability. Seasonal rhythms dictated when and how land was used, reducing stress on natural systems. Even roads and trade routes respected environmental patterns, allowing people to travel efficiently while maintaining balance with the earth. In essence, land management, architecture, and social systems were deeply integrated, forming a civilization that was intelligent, adaptive, and resilient. But such intelligence threatened centralized powers. Emerging empires required control, fixed borders, taxation, and rigid administration to consolidate authority. A civilization like Tartaria, which functioned without coercion, challenged the fundamental logic of dominance. And so, erasure began. Maps were redrawn, textbooks rewritten, symbols buried, and oral traditions dismissed. Knowledge that had persisted for centuries was fragmented, leaving only scattered traces for those willing to observe carefully. Even in erasure, Tartaria's resilience is evident. Ancient roads still follow curves designed for efficiency and sustainability. Buildings continue to function according to principles of balance and alignment. Water systems deliver precisely what is needed without modern technology. Agricultural practices rooted in Roki survive in pockets, producing fertility and abundance in ways modern methods sometimes fail to replicate. The civilization may be absent from records, but its logic endures in the land and its structures. Symbols carved into stones, alignments with celestial events, and hidden markers transmitted knowledge silently across vast distances. Architecture, infrastructure, and trade networks combined to form a global system that connected continents, enabling movement, communication, and sustainable living without central authority. Where modern historians see anomalies or coincidence, the truth is deliberate design, demonstrating intelligence and coordination that rival modern technology. What is perhaps most remarkable is how this knowledge persists unconsciously. Modern societies, though unaware, still follow patterns established by Tartaria. Urban planning, road networks, and even agricultural rotations occasionally echo ancient methods. Buildings, foundations, and stonework silently guide behavior, preserving centuries-old wisdom. The civilization may have been hidden from history, but it was never entirely lost. The lesson of Tartaria and Roki is clear: knowledge, intelligence, and sustainable systems do not require domination to endure. Civilization can thrive through observation, design, and harmony with natural patterns. Power is not measured by conquest but by the ability to create systems that function efficiently and equitably. And even when erased from memory, a civilization's logic can persist quietly, waiting for those who are willing to notice. Tonight, imagine standing at the intersection of past and present. Trace the roads, buildings, and waterways that survived centuries of erasure. See the patterns in the stars, the flow of water, the rotation of crops, and the alignments of structures. Understand that Tartaria and Roki were not mistakes, myths, or coincidences. They were deliberate systems of intelligence and balance. They remind us that the world can be organized differently, that harmony can guide human life, and that wisdom embedded in the land can outlast rulers, empires, and rewritten history. Even as modern civilization moves forward, these systems endure beneath the surface. Tartaria and Roki are silent teachers, urging us to observe, question, and remember. Their legacy challenges assumptions, invites exploration, and offers a vision of a world where intelligence, sustainability, and human ingenuity coexist without domination. And so, the story of Tartaria ends not in destruction, but in quiet persistence. Its cities, symbols, and systems continue to breathe beneath the layers of history. Its knowledge waits for the patient observer, for the one willing to trace its roads, alignments, and hidden messages. Tartaria was erased from maps and books, but it was never truly gone. Its memory survives in the world itself, for those who choose to see. As we drift back from the hidden cities, the secret roads, and the silent wisdom of Tartaria and Roki, remember this: the world still carries their memory beneath the surface. Every stone, every canal, every alignment whispers knowledge that centuries of history tried to erase. But it survives, quietly, patiently, waiting for those who notice. If tonight's journey through lost civilizations and buried truths stirred your curiosity, let it grow. Explore the patterns around you. Question what history tells you. And carry the quiet intelligence of Tartaria with you, in every step and every observation. For more hidden histories, lost civilizations, and mysteries waiting beneath the maps, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Each discovery is just a step closer to understanding the world they tried to hide. Sleep now, but keep these secrets alive in your dreams. The roads are still there waiting.